Well, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us on this video. If you're watching it live, it means you're a member of Time Crafting Trust Premium. I'm seeing Tim and Gloria Gino. It's all rather quiet. Yeah, we wanted to, we're getting ourselves into this live stream today. And also keep in mind that there are so many different platforms for guests and people to use to not only live stream but to do their podcasts. And not everybody's used Ecamm before. So there can be a bit of a learning curve. We're going to probably talk a bit about learning curves and learning skills and how to, that'll come up during our conversation today. And I'll bring in our guest here in a moment. But again, if you are enjoying this live stream and you want to ask questions, we can bring questions into the video here. So if you have any questions for our guest, then you can bring those in. And also, if you are watching this after it's been released, it means that the podcast episode is out. So you can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, what have you. But again, the early access to this stuff and the ad-free version of the podcast is available to Time Crafting Trust Premium members only. Gloria Jean is a member of the community. I just alluded to her. Tim, I can see Janet in here as well. And Sarah, who's my operations coordinator, will be facilitating the chat today. So that way I can focus on having a wonderful conversation with our guest. Mithu, thanks for joining me today. Mithu, I'm going to see, this is why I get people to pronounce their names at the beginning of the episode. So it's Mithu Storoni. I got it right? Did I get it right?
It's Mithu Storoni.
Mithu.
The H
Mithu
is,
Storoni.
Yeah,
got
the
it.
H is silent.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here today and joining me on the program. I'm really excited to share Hyperefficient with my community initially, and then of course once we get going with the rest of the world via the Productive Conversation podcast. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to join you.
So I am just to give you a sense of what will happen here is you're gonna have a line that every guest says this. We do the intro and outro completely separate with the bio and all that stuff, and then from there what we do is we kind of just have an organic conversation. I mean, you're in the UK, so I don't know if mine is filled with coffee, and the time of day for you, I don't know if it would be filled with anything but water. Am I on point there? Is it water for you, or are you now at chamomile tea point?
Well, it's 5 p.m. here, so it's afternoon tea point.
Gotcha.
Just after.
All right. Well, let's get started. So what I'm going to do is you've got I'm going to hit record here on my Rodecaster Pro. And what you're going to say is, hi, my name is, state your name, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy. And then we just go into it. All right. So do you have that? You ready? All right. Here we go. I'm going to count you in and then we'll get started. 3, 2, 1, go.
Hi, I'm Mithu Storoni, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Me too. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me today. This is a conversation I've wanted to have for a while, and I'm excited that we get to do it here today. So thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the book is called Hyperefficient, and I'm looking at it on my iPad. I've got one of the galley copies here from when the book was just getting ready to be released. It's out in the world now. So if you're looking to purchase the book, we'll share links and all that fun stuff at the end of our conversation today. But the first thing that caught my eye out of the gate, other than the title and the idea of efficiency, and we'll get into that, was you have there's a lot of Marshall McLuhan quotes, and you mentioned Marshall McLuhan in other conversations as well. And as a Canadian, that warmed my heart. Have you spent time looking at his work in particular, or is it just kind of found its way into the work that you do with Stress Proof, of course, and then also with this book?
No, I stumbled upon his work, and I would say that a lot of this book is almost entirely inspired by him. He kind of sowed the seed, and I followed that forward. And especially, during the time of the pandemic in 2020, when life sort of stopped and people started living in terms of information networks, it struck me just how prescient many of his ideas were, and how looking at the world through some of his angles actually gave a better explanation of what is going on and what productivity is all about, what work is all about.
And back then he faced both praise, but a lot of kind of naysayers. and some of his ideas were polarizing. And it's interesting because we're in that kind of era now. I don't think that era really, I think it always, like, there are things that repeat, cycles that repeat throughout history. And when first off, I listened to your conversation with Srini on the Unmistakable Creative. We'll link to that episode in the show notes. And Srini is a fantastic interview. He's been on the show before as well. I've known him for a number of years, and he goes deep into stuff whenever he talks to someone. It's interesting because this podcast is about productivity. It's about having a productive conversation and looking at productivity through not just the quantitative lens, which is where we've been for so long. You talked about motion theory and Taylorism and all that stuff. And the balance where quality kind of gets forsaken for quantity simply because of the nature of speed and the industrial era and so on and so forth. But when we talk about your books with authors, I don't typically go chronologically. Go figure. Time moves in different ways. And I like to go kind of where the conversation floats. And I looked at your bio. I looked at your history. You were an eye surgeon before you moved into writing. And there's actually a part in the book where you talk about the gaze, like the idea of your eyes when you talk about the rhythms of your body. And I've never really seen anyone when they're writing a book that covers this topic, and you cover it differently than others. Let's be clear about that. And I know that one of our community members specifically was really interested in not only hearing this conversation, but also really enjoyed conversations that he's heard you had with other podcasters. But the eyes, the movement of the eyes piece really struck me. And I'm wondering if you're willing to go into that a little bit before, as we make our way through our conversation, because from a person who has spent time studying the eye, and you kind of have to do what you did to like apply it to this. What was that like for you as you went through that? And did it kind of see your two worlds cross into one when you were looking at that, when you were kind of writing that piece about the gaze and about how the movement of the eyes has a role in all of this?
Well, this is such a great question, and I wish everyone would ask me this, because actually, again, we spoke about Marshall McLuhan, who is a big inspiration for this book, but an inspiration even long before I came across his work was actually my work in pupillometry. So now we're getting into a really niche topic, but I spent part of my neuro-ophthalmology PhD studying the movements of the pupils. And if we talk about the eyes being the window to the soul, or the window to the soul is how we talk about eyes. The pupils are actually a window to a particular network in the brain, which is what I refer to as the blue dot network. And so you can tell how a person is feeling, you can measure sort of their mental state, you can measure how well they're likely to focus, how distracted they are, how much their mind is wandering, these different mental states, just by looking at the movements of the pupils. So that's how extraordinary the relationship of the eyes and behavior is. And if you extrapolate from that and you take a slightly more macroscopic view, then of course you look at the eyes in general. The eyes always have something called saccadic movements, which are these microscopic sort of shuffles and shifts. And those are always present because, your eyes, if you were to force them to gaze at one spot without these microscopic saccades, your world would dim out, your world would go black. So you need to have these tiny little saccadic movements to just keep the visual picture alive. But what I'm describing here is, if you take a step back and talk about the kind of macroscopic, not microscopic movements, the ones that we voluntarily apply. So if we are frazzled, if we are anxious, we know because our eyes dart everywhere, our pupils are dilated. And you can really sense that it's a form of nonverbal communication. If you meet someone, you can tell whether they're calm, they're controlled, or whether they're jittery and anxious or even aggressive. So much of this messaging comes from the eyes. And so looking at the movements of the eyes, it's a really great gauge because it correlates almost directly to the person's mental state and behavior. So we can play with this and flip it. And that's where I draw on the data that shows that looking into an object, a target, or within sort of 10 degrees of the target, if you can manage to do that and hold your gaze, your mind almost marches in line with you. So your mind calms down too. And so this has been shown in competitions, so archery, shooting, surgeons do it, especially microsurgeons. So you have this direct correlation between the behavior of the eyes and the mental state of the human.
Now, why I was also fascinated about this was I wear progressive lenses. And what I find is when I meditate, I am actually able to meditate, I found better, for lack of a better term, when I don't have my glasses on, because I can't see as well. So I am able to focus. If I'm focusing on one very, very particular object, say like the red dot on my recorder or something like that, I feel that. Like it's like my brain knows, like, well, there's nothing else you can do, so here we go. Right? That's how it kind of feels. Is this kind of what you're talking about to a degree?
Exactly. So, your attention is essentially the gate opener into your brain. And wherever your eyes go, your attention engages with that point, because it's your attention that is being drawn away. Your eyes are simply sort of the camera aperture to your attention. So as soon as your eyes go to a particular target, your brain is forced to process the information from that target. So if you get very good at stilling your gaze and focusing on one target only, then your brain is forced to discard the noise that's coming from around you, and you have more control over what you want your attention to focus on and hence process.
Excellent. See, that was just the beginning of it. And you talked about the circadian aspect with this in particular. And anyone who's listened to the show before knows that I'm a night owl. You do bring up the larks, the night owls, the 25%, 20 to 25%. It varies depending on, which studies you look at. And when we get into the section of the book that talks about the rhythms of the world, the rhythms of the mind, and the rhythms of the body, I think it's in body comes before mind. But nonetheless, I find that as a night owl, and I'm sure I'm not alone, that the rhythms of external factors, the way the world has been working, doesn't necessarily abide by the way that my circadian rhythm, the way that I'm able to function. Luckily, I do have a lot of agency over my time. I can start my day a little bit later, et cetera, et cetera. And this led me to think about all of that section where we talk about the different rhythms. How do we pay more attention to those when we're living in a world that really has more of an objective way of kind of operating, where it's like we don't really care about these other rhythms. We're so focused on output at all costs, quote, productivity, versus, say, I like to use the term productiveness instead, the state of being productive, as opposed to like this idea of activity for the sake of just cranking out things. And you allude to the idea of what's changed as well in the book. So much we could go into. We don't have enough time to go into everything. But how do you help somebody, and what are some of the things that someone can do where they feel like the movements of the world that they're constantly paying attention to or adhering to? How do they shift into those other three rhythms that you talk about in the book? What are some of the gateways to that?
So the first step really is to view mental output and to view life, if you like, because life, all aspects of it, is a form of productivity. You're giving, you're creating some kind of output. So the first step is to view all of this as a rhythmic mechanism, in the sense that if you have periods of intensity, you need periods of letting the elastic band relax. So tension, relaxation, that's the sort of very basic way of looking at it. So whatever your work is, whether you're working night shifts, whether you are forced into working night shifts, whether you are forced into a particular pattern of work, it's very important at the very fundamental level to work in a pattern that has intensities of on and long periods of off. So if you can manage nothing else, that's the first thing to do. Now, nature has crafted that for us. Some people are indeed shifted earlier or later than others, but by and large, nature has crafted a world, has crafted life such that we are supposed to sort of live in that way. We have periods of light daylight activity. The blue light during the daytime correlates with alertness. It actually induces alertness. It doesn't just correlate with it, it induces alertness. If you look at the spectrum of daylight, the spectrum shifts from being red dominated first thing in the morning, last thing at night, to moving towards the bluer end of the spectrum in the peak of noon and around that sort of time. And our alertness levels vary in this way. So we are all, and of course, the temperature, usually if you are, living in reasonably temperate parts of the world, I know you're living in Canada, but you have, we warm up while while the sun rises in the sky. The body naturally cools down. So our entire physiology is sort of, geared and shaped and tailored towards this on and off. But if you find yourself in situations where you lose this rhythmicity, that's where things start going wrong. It goes wrong, of course, with mental performance, because we know that you don't produce output like muscle. You can't just assemble parts on a line and keep producing continuous output. You can, but it's never of your best quality. So the brain has these spurts of activity. It has times of the day when it is most able to carry out these activities. And we know that at 3 a.m, our ancestors rarely went for a hunt or a forage.
True.
And yet that's what we are doing. So we are kind of removing, flattening out these natural undulations in rhythmicity, which we need. And I think just bringing that rhythmicity back to whatever, to whatever degree is possible for you in your work, I think that's the first step to take.
All right, I want to circle back to the title, because when I hear the term hyper in front of anything, anxiety kind of can turn up a little bit. I'm sure I'm not alone, right? And I'm a big proponent of the term efficient in terms as it being a byproduct of being productive. So in other words, for me, I believe that productivity or being productive is the link of intention, what you intend to do, whether it's big, small, whatever, and your attention. And you bring up attentional allotedness, which is key because it lives in both time and space, right? And then to me, when I see the word efficient, that is a byproduct of you keeping that active link. So the more you keep that link active, the more effective you can be because that link is there, and the more efficient you become because, again, that link is stronger. And then efficiency comes from that. When you talk about the hyper aspect, I would just love you to kind of put a lay of the land out there, or for those that are like hyper, like when they judge the book by its cover, how do you say, whoa, hold up. I don't want to, for lack of a better term, stress you out when you think about that, because some people, when they think about these ideas of being productive, are like, I'm already feeling like I'm productive enough. You're asking me to do more, which is not what's happening inside of your pages of your book.
Correct. So the hyper-efficient is really a little bit of a play on words, where we talk about efficiency being quantitative. So you're just carrying on working like a machine, like a robot, assembling parts, like a human that can very easily be replaced by AI. Mm-hmm. Whereas hyper-efficient is when the quality of your output is extraordinary, is at your best, at your peak level. That's what I describe as hyper-efficient. But there is another angle to this, which is quite subtly buried in the book, which is that in one chapter, I describe the state of flow. Now, flow has been almost over-spoken about. And even though that's the case, it remains very mysterious. But what I found very, very fascinating is a recent line of research, or several recent lines of research, that show that actually one of the things that happens when we feel we're in this state of flow, which is notoriously difficult, of course, to study in a lab because it doesn't happen on command, is that flow itself may be an energetically hyper-efficient state. Because if you think about it, whenever your brain is doing any task, it's doing work. It's metabolizing ATP, it's burning energy and using that energy as fuel. So there is an energetic component to it. And when your work feels difficult, or when you're not doing your work to the highest and best possible level, there is an energetically defined um, inefficiency about it, because the work you are doing, you're not completely engaging with it for whatever reason. And so it's feeling difficult to do. But when you're in this state of what is subjectively described as flow, when it feels, time is passing, you feel completely absorbed, very engaged. If you actually look inside the brain and look at the possible ways in which this is happening, you actually have the brain state in almost perfect compatibility with the task that you're doing, which causes the whole dynamics to take place in a very, very efficient and hence hyper efficient, you could argue, way.
It's like symbiotic. Like there's almost like this symbiotic element here. You talk about flow being hard to measure because it's not something you can kind of call on command. It's kind of, I mean, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, really, that's the book that kind of brought it out. And I know that Stephen Kotler, who's been on the show, talks about it as well. But another thing that comes up, and we've touched on it a little bit, is quality, because Robert Pirsig was like, his life's work was like trying to study the different elements of quality, whether he explored it in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Lila, and then his posthumous book on quality. And to me, when I was going through the chapter on, like, the section on too little time, which again is, I love where it's placed in the book too, because you kind of like set the table, like, by the way, there's these things, the uncertainty stuff, like this is stuff like, yes, this, and people are probably asking, yeah, but what about this? What about this? And like, hey, I'm going to address this stuff now. And you talk about the problems with deadlines and all of that stuff. To me, quality is that when you get there, that's where I think quality can kind of really take a hit, because you're dealing with things like people working to due dates instead of trying to make it incremental, let's say. So do you think, I'm probably answering this question out of the gate, but because we've been so focused on the quantity of output and not the quality, it's because it's so difficult to measure and it's so subjective. Is that why quality takes kind of a back seat, or are there other things that you found when you've been doing this research and working on the book that causes quality to not rise above, or at least come to the same level as quantity when it comes to being productive?
Well, historically, we have not needed to focus on quality for various reasons. So if you go all the way back to the assembly lines, there was quality control, so your quality could never be worse than a certain level. But there was also no need for every product to be as beautiful as it could be. It just needed to be assembled. And then when we translated that to the knowledge workspace post Second World War, if you think of any organization that is that predominates in knowledge work, in that organization, aside from the very top layer of the pyramid, the majority of that pyramid, of that organization, will be doing quantitative knowledge work. In the early era of the internet, this involved emails, making PowerPoint presentations, writing reports, collecting data and presenting data and sharing data and analyzing data. And it's only now that this level of mental work can be easily given away to AI and automation, that humans are now left with these extraordinary tools, and you can only have an edge from one organization to the other by using these tools as creatively and as wisely as possible. And so now, even if you're at the bottom layer of the organization in terms of seniority, rank, experience, you will be thinking and behaving a little bit like a senior executive, because you will have all these AI assistants doing your PowerPoint presentation for you. So you have to create one that stands out. And so quality really now becomes the deciding factor of success.
So we're in that weird space in the middle right now then of because AI is like fairly new to the mainstream. So we're in that weird kind of, let's get used to it, let's figure out what to do. That's why you say wisdom, why we have to use it wisely. We're still figuring out we can't really use it wisely until we spend enough time with it, I'm guessing, right? I feel like we're in that awkward teenage or early phase where it's going to take us some time to get that kind of rhythm in place.
Right. And it's sort of seeping into all these different industries through the back door, sometimes through the front door at other times. Anything that's automated can now be given away to AI. And so we are at this transition point, but at this transition point, this is this is a consideration that which we really, really have to ponder. And even if you've been lucky enough to not be disrupted, it's definitely something to think about. I mean, as an example, the book that I've just written, Hyperefficient, one of my goals when writing it was, how do I write this book that no chatbot will be able to write? And so I had to, every step of the way, I kept thinking that, okay, can ChatGPT do this better than me? Because, as a writer, that's something to think about. If you're working in other, in other areas that involve this sort of creative writing, now that's a consideration. So many media organizations now employing chatbots instead of humans to write their news articles for them. So it is going to be a disruptive force. And so the creativity, the out-of-the-box thinking, and really the bottom line is the quality of your mental output will become the deciding factor.
I want to dive back into that niche that we talked about with eye movements, because we've got a question for one of the members of my community. And you actually, spoiler alert, ADHD does come up in the rhythm. You have a special case thing listed there, but I want to see if you can bring this to Tim's attention and help him kind of understand if this actually does play a role. But for those that are listening, you can't see this question. I'll rhyme it off for you. Is there any research looking at eye movements, attention is what he's put in parentheses, and ADHD?
Yes, there is. There is actually research along the spectrum of all kinds of neuroscientific, neurological kind of diagnoses or behavioral diagnoses, psychological diagnoses. And in terms of ADHD, it is, there are different lines of thought as to where it's clearly a multifaceted situation, but it manifests in a variety of ways, and visual ways, especially things like pupillometry, are being sort of researched and probed in that area. There is no finding that I'm aware of that gives you any treatment modality based on eye movements as yet, but I would definitely say watch this space.
Excellent. Now, I'm sure, and I know because it's come up in other conversations, you talk about power laws and gears. We're not going to get into that too much in this conversation because we don't have a lot of time, and there's a lot of depth there. And I think it's like some of the foundational elements of the book, so I don't want to gloss over it. We'll come back to it in a second, but when I was going through back to the rhythms, and this is the rhythms of the body section again, stimulants came up. And I couldn't help but think about another person who's known for their work in optometry. They're known for being someone who has research and works in as an eye doctor. Andrew Huberman comes up and talks about caffeine and how you should go about your morning and what you should do. And I see the caffeine piece and I'm like, is Mithu giving me permission to have caffeine first thing in the morning now, or do I have to wait? So I'm wondering, especially as that night owl. And I know you bring that up where you're like, sometimes it's the caffeine that happens later in the day that can affect sleep and have a night owl stay up even later because the remnants of that. So what are your thoughts around this idea of, where that stimulant of caffeine comes into play? Because for me, caffeine, like making my morning coffee isn't just about, in fact, it's secondarily about getting caffeine in my system. It's the ritual of the pour over and the nice smells that come with it. You talk about sound and all that stuff as well. What are your thoughts on this idea of do this, don't have coffee before this time, et cetera, and how that plays into hyper efficiency?
So as a physician, I'm very aware of the complex system-like nature of the brain. So when you give prescriptive rules, they almost never work for everyone. They may work for some people, but they will not work for everyone. And actually, this is even true in broader medicine. So coming back to your question on caffeine, well, to begin with, so I don't know exactly what Huberman's angle is. I must confess I have not watched that or come across that information. But with caffeine generally, there are two angles to it. The first angle is if you take caffeine first thing in the morning, then you are jolting yourself out of this kind of dreamy, creative, slow state of mind, which is optimal for creative idea generation. When you take any form of caffeine, you immediately feel that it's much easier to focus. Okay, you have control over your attention. The report that you were looking at an hour ago before caffeine, suddenly it makes sense to you.
Right.
So that's the only kind of area where I would go. I would say that, okay, well, if you want to preserve that kind of creative, dreamy state, hold out caffeine for longer. But I'm definitely not aware of anything else, medically speaking, which would say don't take caffeine first thing in the morning if that's a ritual you also have. Also bearing in mind that we all have caffeine tolerance from regular consumption. So if you're used to taking your coffee in the morning, then not taking it and sacrificing your comfort around it, I'm not sure about the benefits that would bring. It's definitely much better for you to take your caffeine earlier in the day than in the latter half in order to be able to fall asleep.
Yeah, and I only have typically 1 to 2 cups. So this is helpful information. I can now no, I actually have decaf coffee first thing in the morning typically. So, all right, we're gonna circle back to the gears and the power laws really quickly before we wrap up. And I know we're going to have to give like a Cliff's Notes, or in Canada, Cole's Notes version of what this kind of looks like, because there are different gears that you touch on, and you talk about a quick way to check your gear. There's diagrams in this, and there's also what I like too is that you offered like kind of these flow chart or tables at the end of chapters to kind of help people, if they first off, you're right, ChatGPT certainly couldn't have come up with that stuff as well. But the point is it allows for that kind of quick reference. So can you explain me what and to the audience here, what you mean by the different gears and how to kind of leverage them and use them in a way to become hyper efficient?
So the gear concept is a metaphorical concept. It's based on a network in the brain called the blue dot network, which deals with norepinephrine. The gear concept really is a way of visualizing your brain as an as an information processing machine that works in 3 speeds: slow, medium, and fast. Gear 1, gear 2, and gear 3. And this is a metaphor that I'm using purely in the context of work, of mental work. And if you bear those 2 things in mind, this is what this sort of translates to. So if you are up in the morning and you haven't yet had your cup of coffee and you're in this kind of slow, daydreamy state, you're aware of the world, you're clearly awake, but you don't have the urge, you don't have the willpower, you don't have the kind of the comfort of being able to plant your attention on something and focus very, very deeply on a document, on your computer, on work. You're in this kind of hazy, daydreamy state. That is what I describe as gear 1. Now we go to the diametric opposite before we come to the middle. So gear 3 is the opposite of that. Gear 3 is the mental state you have when you're sitting at work and a very nice colleague has just generously brought you a triple espresso, not knowing you just had your espresso half an hour ago. So you were able to focus really well on your screen, on your work, and suddenly you take this espresso from your very generous colleague, but as soon as you finish drinking it, the drilling outside suddenly becomes unbearably loud and you can hear everything in the room. So that sort of attention state where you have sharp focus, but it kind of leapfrogs and it jumps onto everything and anything that's coming your way, that's potentially disrupting or calling your attention towards it. So that's gear 3. Gear 2 is the Goldilocks zone. In gear 2, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain kind of in the front of your head, right behind your forehead, it's what makes us human. It allows you to carry out complex thinking, analytical thinking, mathematics, very complex decision making, all of those things, and working memory as well. That part of your brain is fully engaged in gear 2. In gear 1, it's not fully engaged. In gear 3, it's not fully engaged. It is fully engaged in gear 2, and that's why in gear 2, you're able to have full control over your attention, to the extent that if you want to, you can let your attention drift a little bit and let your mind wander if you need to, if you're doing something creative or solving a problem or brainstorming, but you can also bring your attention back. That is the gear 2 state.
This has been phenomenal. I want to ask one more question before I let you go, and this circles back to the idea of energy, right? Which you've touched on, and we've touched on a few times during our conversation today. Why? Why is not maybe? How does someone figure out a way to look at their list, to look at what they need to do, and kind of have a bit of a rhythmic shift, or even maybe for them it's a big shift to when they look at that list saying, this is what I can do at this time when I'm in, this is a gear one thing. This is a time of day thing, rather than work how we have for a long time, which is sequentially on our list, or it's today is the day I do this stuff regardless of how I quote feel. And really that's what I'm saying is how does someone look at their to-do list and go, what do I feel like doing, or what do I feel like I can do right now? How do you break that barrier that I think a lot of people struggle with?
So you look at your to-do list, and first you could divide your work in four categories, or four separate categories. So first of all, ask yourself, which of these things requires me to be creative? If you're thinking about a solution, thinking about a new idea, that's a creative thing to do. And which of these things on my list need me to focus intensely? So it could be writing some difficult emails, going through some reports, doing a presentation, preparing the presentation, all of these things. So first divide your work into creative and focused. If it's creative, I would shift the timing of that task to first thing in the morning. And if you have enough energy, last thing at night. So those are your creative boundaries. Put everything else into the middle of the day. So mid-morning to lunchtime, mid-afternoon to later in the day. Bearing in mind that immediately after lunchtime, we all have a post-lunch dip. Whether you take coffee or not, it makes no difference. And there's a new paper published on that. As in, take coffee first thing in the morning or not. If you take coffee nearer the time of your post-lunch dip, yes, you can definitely keep your alertness levels up. But post-lunch, there is a kind of slump in attention. So that's the time to schedule in things that you really don't like to do or are not important. Even better thing to do, if possible, is take a quick 10 to 15 minute nap if you can. Most of us cannot if you're not working from home, but that's an even better thing to do. So creative time, focused time, sort of gear one task time. Within each schedule, so when you're doing focused work, try to break it into slots of maximum 90 minutes. If you're working on something very, very intense, then you can make it shorter and take regular breaks. The key with a break is, if you don't want to lose momentum and you don't want to lose your thoughts, keep your break to under 10 minutes, so 10 minutes or under. And when you're working, you sit down to work on a work session, look at everything you have to do, your to-do list, and most of us have a variety of tasks that need doing. Even if you look at emails, some emails are really difficult, some emails are routine, some emails are just box ticking. So even looking at something like that, preserve the first bit of your work schedule segment of the 90 minutes to do really, really tough work, and glide into lighter work around about 20 minutes through, so that the whole session, if you consider intensity, looks a little bit like a power law.
Me too. This has been a great conversation. The book is called Hyperefficient, Optimize Your Brain to Transform the Way You Work. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Where can people pick up the book, and where can they keep up with the work that you're doing?
So thank you again so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. You can get the book on Amazon and on any other book outlets across the United States, across North America, so Canada, Amazon as well, Barnes and Noble, all of these things. I have a website, my name, www.mithustoroni.com, where I do give you a link to my publisher and these outlets. And I'm also on LinkedIn and on X.
Thanks for having a productive conversation with me today.
Thank you again so much for having me.
All right, I've hit stop on the Roadcaster. This was great. There's people in the just I didn't want to put this on the podcast recording. I know it's on the live stream. Because we've chosen Hyperefficient as the book of our book club month in October. there's people saying, would Mithu be willing to come back to answer questions on that? I said, I'm not gonna hold you to anything because I know you've got a lot of things going, but maybe what we can do is arrange where if it's like people have questions, I can send them to you, and asynchronously we can kind of do something if it won't work out that way.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. I'd be very happy to. I'm very honored that you're reading it. So absolutely, if you have any questions, shoot them my way. It'll be a pleasure.
There's lots of people really, oh wow, Kimi saying, I will be changing how I handle my tasks. That's really, really, I mean, just from a 40-minute conversation, we're getting some of this. So this has been great. I'm going to end the live stream now. Mithu, can you stick around for like another minute in the green room? And I know we're at time, but if you could stick around for another minute, I'd love to just put a button on things there. But for everybody that's watching the live stream or watching the recording, thank you so much. Again, you could subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including right here on YouTube. And for Time Crafting Trust Premium members, of course, you can watch this video now and get the podcast episode ad-free as members. So thank you so much for being here today, watching this video, whether it's live or the recording, and we'll see you later.